All right. Ad Work Not Worries podcast. Welcome back, everybody. Anybody who's been listening to the podcast, we want to let you know we really appreciate you. If you appreciate us, we only ask one thing. Please share. Well, I guess we ask two things. Share and review. Share with your friends. Share with anybody you think can get any useful information from the podcast. But also, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whatever platform you're listening, if you would be so kind to give us a review, and a review with stars, but also a few kind words would be super helpful. And I know if you're glazing over this, everyone listens to the ask when asked for reviews and does nothing. If that's you, do something. If you could please review us, it would be greatly appreciated. We're going to keep providing content, and if it's useful to you, we want you to enjoy. We just ask for a share and a review. This is as voted by an independent board, the number one podcast in the US, featuring a guy wearing this hat with a black bill and these glasses, and today this comfy Howler Bros fleece. Podcast with those credentials, number one in the US, and we are just humbled by that, and we plan to do all we can to maintain that top spot. Today's podcast, it's Friday, which means Free Flow Friday. And I thought, in light of recent events, it's down in LA, very unfortunate what's happening down there with the fires. You know, we wish everyone safety and health, and that the rebuild effort is swift and people are not, affected for longer than they need to be. It's terrible when this happens. It does bring up some questions and points and ideas surrounding building construction, and what is the future, and what does fire mitigation look like in relation to building construction. So what I wanted to do on today's podcast is take a minute and discuss 10 points for fire mitigation or fire suppression building practices that I think are going to be increasingly beneficial and useful in the future, and that you can incorporate into your building design and or construction fairly easy. I've actually worked in a couple areas in Oregon and California. Oregon has specific fire interface areas where you have to follow specific building standards, and California has the WUI district, which is the Wild Urban Interface Fire District, that requires you follow fire safe practices. And it's typically little things you have to do, but little things that can make a huge difference in creating barriers and creating time to, for the fire department to, address a fire or in your area at your home, and or possibly even have a fire completely miss your home envelope because of some defensible techniques you can take. Let's jump right in to some fire safe building practices. I'm going to go 10 bullet points right here. Apologize if I'm looking over. I have my notes right there to the left of me. First, and this is obvious, using fire resistant building materials is the number one thing you can do to help your home have a fighting chance in the event a fire reaches your area. Now, what that looks like, depending on the, and I know architecturally, there's going to be different materials you have to use, because you're not going to design a home aesthetically strictly surrounding the fire safe materials. You might be designing a modern home which is heavy in stucco. However, stucco is quite fire resistant, so that's going to be great. It's a concrete type product. But you also could be designing a more traditional home with siding, or a mountain modern home, or a craftsman home with siding. However, in any of those scenarios, you can use fire-safe building materials. We're building a home in Atherton, California right now, and it's going to be all cedar siding and all cedar shake roofing. So just, what you would think of would be a tinderbox. However, the building materials, the shakes that we're using, and the siding shingles that we're using are all dipped in a product that is made for fire suppression. So actually, when they do burn studies, this product has, I believe, a 3 or 4 hour rating where it won't even catch on fire. And if you compare that to a normal untreated cedar product, it'll go up immediately as if it was kindling. So some fire resistant materials to note, if you're doing a wood roof or wood siding, they have fire treated siding, and most siding suppliers now are big into this, and you could ask them what their fire suppression techniques are surrounding treating their wood, what kind of defensible time frame does that give you, and this, that, or the other. Roofing, depending on, again, the style you're going for, composition roofing does not burn as quickly as a wood roof. The best roof by far for fire mitigation would be a metal roof. Obviously, metal is not going to catch fire, but it's not just the roof. When we're talking the building envelope and the eaves specifically, when you're insulating a structure, if you insulate with batt insulation and there's any kind of air cavity in your ceiling joists, you need to vent that out. So if you're venting your home because you have an air cavity in your attic or rafters that you need to vent out of the eave, they do make special eave vents that don't allow embers into the structure. So you can buy a special eave vent, and you could look it up online, a fire safe eave vent or soffit vent that doesn't allow embers in. Basically, it's like your normal soffit venting, but it has a little metal mesh film behind it, so embers can't get in. That's one way to go to stop embers from getting past your fireproof siding and into the structure, and maybe catching something in the attic or your insulation on fire. The best by far would be go zero ventilation, but that would require you go with a spray foam or a fully insulated cavity, because you can't have an air pocket. The reason you can't have an air pocket inside of your framing, because when you get the temperature differential from the exterior to the interior and you have an air pocket, it tends to form condensation, and that can lead to mildew, mold, etc. But if you fill that whole cavity on the interior, you don't have the need for exterior venting, and you could just eliminate venting altogether. So you could have a solid soffit or solid eave. That's by far the best, doesn't allow fire to intrude. From there, some of your common spaces, like your garage, make sure your fireproofing is on point. Like you're going to use 5/8 fireproof rock. Make sure you're going to caulk all those seams to make sure there's no, or rather there's a barrier from those common spaces into the main living area of the home. Those are a few materials you can look at. There's obviously many more, and honestly, you might be thinking about how you're going to design the house architecturally to mitigate fire in the long run, and that may change your whole design aesthetic. Maybe you decide you just really want to be safe, and you're going to go with more this, stucco Mediterranean villa or modern structure as opposed to a more traditional sided structure because of the risk of fire. So use fire resistant materials, many other options, but these are some of the key ones for your defensible space. You can also look at your siding and decks out of the same materials that you use for the home, or rather your decks and kind of those spaces, the same materials you're using for siding, etc. That's number one. Number two, you can create a defensible space around the perimeter of your home, and this is really key, and often fire districts require this. And these defensible spaces just don't allow fire to transfer directly from the exterior landscape into the home. So what that a defensible space could look like, for instance, in a home we just built, the defensible space was a 5-foot perimeter where you couldn't have any vegetation that encroached into this 5 foot. So if I wanted to plant a decorative Japanese maple, I had to make sure that I planted the drip line, which is the tree branch area, couldn't extend within 5 feet from the building pad, and then from the building, and then from the building out 5 feet, you would typically have something like a decorative gravel. You could have soil, but you wouldn't want to do bark because you don't want any wood element there. You could do a decomposed granite. If you don't know what granite fines are, they're a nice sand-looking material, but they're more firm. They can come in like a gray or a gold tone. Again, things like that won't catch. You can also incorporate some higher-end landscape techniques, and we can talk about that in one of my other points. But creating that defensible barrier around the home where you don't have any vegetation that touches the home is really key. And that includes looking at what existing trees might be around your home, and is any of the tree line extending over your roof structure? Do those trees need to be limbed? That defensible space, picture it from your walls leading up into the air. Is anything encroaching into that 5-foot barrier around the home that could potentially cause something to fall on the roof that's on fire, or an ember to get over to the home or get in the home? That's very key, is having this defensible space. Number 3, fire breaks. Now, fire breaks are, if you've seen a fire crew in action when they go out and fight wildland fires, oftentimes what they'll do to try to direct the fire or stop the fire in its path is they'll get out the bulldozers. Let's say it's a rolling hill that has a bunch of brush. They'll get out the bulldozers and they'll try to cut a huge roadway. And what that roadway does is eliminates all the brush, gets down to dirt that's not going to catch fire, and that is going to stop the fire when it gets to that point from continuing on its path. Now, obviously, if it's a raging fire and you have high winds, that becomes very tough because the fires can jump. There was a fire in California a few years back, and it jumped the 2 lanes, or not 2 lanes, but a two-way freeway, I believe 3 or 4 lanes each. It jumped right over the freeway in a matter of seconds just because of the power of the fire and the high winds. So that doesn't always work. But creating fire breaks, and specifically what that means, and this is typically if you have a big enough property. If you're in a neighborhood, it's a little tougher to do something like this. But you could create maybe a gravel walkway around the property. Picture it like a moat of gravel, or a dirt walkway, or again, these decomposed granite big walkways. And this is not in your 5-foot defensible zone that I just talked about. This is more a perimeter moat of some kind of walkway, some kind of graded area that if a fire was in your generalized area, it may hit that and not jump over and go towards the house. So having a fire break is nice. Number 4, and this is pretty short, sweet, and simple. Look or talk to your window manufacturer and talk about upgrades to, whether is it going with all tempered glass, more panes, a thicker layer of argon fill on your double pane window. What is the fire rating for your windows? But your windows are a key element. Many homes have a lot of windows, especially when you're looking at modern structures. So you really want to take into account the fire rating of those windows when you're thinking about building. That's a key element, especially nowadays. So many people are using steel and they have these huge door systems, huge window systems. Well, that creates a lot of areas for fire intrusion. So you want to make sure whatever you're buying, maybe you invest a little more and look at a product that's rated for, whatever it may be, to mitigate fire. 5, I touched on this, but I want to give it its own point because it is so key, and it's proper ventilation. One of the number 1 areas that fire encroaches into a building and causes, a devastating loss is through the ventilation and through the eaves, because when a fire's burning, embers are floating around the air. And most eave structures, if it's just a regular open eave and not a soffitted eave meaning you have your eave overhang coming down with your rafter tails, but then you frame it back to the wall flat and you have it soffitted, so there's an air cavity in that eave. If you have a soffitted eave, you typically have a track-like recessed vent. But a regular recessed vent, when you put it up in there so it allows airflow, are just holes that are maybe an eighth inch diameter, and it's a series of these holes that allow air through. But what also can get through there is embers. So critical in these scenarios, again, if you have a soffitted eave with a channel vent, to get a channel vent that's fire rated, that has a mesh that doesn't allow embers in. And then even worse, if you have an open eave and it's not soffitted, typically you just have bird blocks or eave blocks, where those are the blocks. Imagine your wall going up vertical and the eave extends out. Well, between the rafter tails, there's usually a block, an eave block. But to get ventilation, there's typically 3 holes drilled and they just have a mesh screen over it. Not even a mesh screen, it's just like a mesh welder wire, but they're tight, but still big enough to allow embers in. Well, on those bird blocks or on those eave blocks, you're gonna want to take into account, again, what can intrude. And they do sell screens, or they sell even pre-made eave blocks that have this fire suppression screen built into it. So that's a key. And again, going back to the spray foam, by far and away the best would be fill your interior cavities with spray foam and have zero ventilation on the exterior, so there's no possibility of intrusion. However, I do understand that to insulate a house with batt insulation and have ventilation because of that, a 3,000 square foot house, you might be able to insulate the whole thing for $5,000. If we're talking spray foam, all the ceilings, so you have zero ventilation, that could easily 5-6x. So I know budget constraints matter, but the fireproof channel vents, in the event you have ventilation, are not that expensive. Yes, they're more, but the cost is definitely worth it for the benefit you get. Number 6, and there's companies that do this, although it's kind of tough, and this is honestly a good opportunity for anybody who's interested in starting a little side hustle or something in the business that is very niche, but sealing all gaps and cracks in the structure. Just like think about this, if you were trying to rodent proof your structure, it'd be the same idea. Where do you have any exterior gaps? And maybe it's in your foundation, maybe it's in the house, maybe do you have, you need to look at the base of your siding, and is there a flashing at the base of your siding that covers up your exterior shear? Or does your siding just overhang your exterior shear, and it creates an opportunity for a flame to get up under there and not have direct contact with metal, but rather have direct contact with building material, which would be the shear underneath? I often see this when people install siding, and what they do is they'll have, anyone familiar with the building trades, they'll have your stem wall come up, and then you'll have your sill plate, and you have your exterior shear come down and connect. And then when they install the siding, all they'll do is install the siding on top of that shear. They don't do any kind of like riglet or stucco stop metal or base metal on the siding that covers up the base half inch of that plywood. They'll just overhang the siding. But what happens is that creates a half-inch cavity under the siding where, water intrusion, rodents, or in this case, flames can get up under the siding and touch that combustible material, which is the half-inch shear. So sealing those gaps, and you don't have to use a metal in that scenario, and I'm sorry I'm honing in on this, it's just because I think this is one of the key intrusion areas. You can use like fire caulking or fire foam up under the siding where you have that little air gap, and that's gonna, number one, seal it all off, so rodents or bugs can't get in there, termites in some areas, but that's also gonna create a fire block and not allow the fire to get to the combustible material. I think it's just good practice in general. I would say, cautionary note, if you're using fire foam in that scenario, fire foam can be a hot mess. It expands way more than you think it's going to expand, and it's very strong. So be cautionary when you're using fire foam. You could put too much, you could push the base of your siding out and flare it out, or you could put too much and it just creeps out of the bottom and creates this crazy mess that you have to shave and scrub and to make look good, and just a nightmare. But sealing all the gaps and cracks, whether it's with fire suppression foam, fire caulking is the red caulking. It's a specific caulking. You can get it at any of the home improvement stores. Or if you have openings in your foundation for venting, make sure those vents have some kind of mesh screen similar to what I discussed in the eaves, so that fire or embers cannot get through those locations. So sealing all your gaps and cracks on the exterior to not allow, imagine if any airflow can get through a crack, crevice, etc., that means embers or flames can also get through. So you want to be very careful. Most new building construction, they're making you have fire blocks even within the interior structure, and seal these gaps to make sure that, for instance, if you have an exterior wall and fire was to get into that wall, typically on the top of that wall, they're going to want a draft stop block so that the fire can't go from that wall and draft up into the attic and cause even further damage. They're trying to mitigate it to compartmentalized areas. That's a little more advanced, but for now, exterior sealing gaps and cracks, trying to make that defensible space as impenetrable as possible. 7, this should be a no-brainer. Installing a fire sprinkler system in the home. Now, this isn't obviously easy for all homes, all existing homes. A lot of municipalities don't require fire suppression. Although, when you're building a new home, it's kind of a no-brainer, because in relation to the cost of a new home, the fire suppression system is a fraction or just a small percentage of your overall budget. For instance, I'm building a 4,000 square foot house right now. I want to say the fire suppression system is $17,000 of a $1.5 million budget. It's really not much in relation to the overall budget. Now, granted, I'm mandated to do it in that municipality, but I would think about it in general. It's just a little extra insurance. Yes, if a fire comes through and the house catches on fire, it's going to get everything wet, but it will save the structure, and that's what we're going for here. So you can do a fire sprinkler system. Caveat on the pricing point, it's not just the $17,000 that you have to think about. When you install a fire suppression system, you have to plumb the supply line to the house a little differently. Typically, it's going to require, instead of a basic 3/4, although we don't do that, we typically do minimum 1.25 even if there's no fire suppression. But it typically requires a 2-inch main line coming into the house, and then it hits your fire riser where it has a separate valve that goes to the fire system, and the other line goes to the main water supply. So you'll also have a bigger water line and a new water line to install. So those total costs, if it's $17,000, maybe that becomes more like $20,000 to $25,000 once you do all the infrastructure work. But again, not a huge percentage of your overall budget, and a huge safety measure you can take into place. They also have, and I have not used this, but I've seen it in action and it looks really cool. They have exterior fire suppression systems now, and it's something to really think about. I don't know the cost exactly. I've heard it's a little more than an interior fire suppression, but these exterior fire suppression systems can be installed around the perimeter of the home, on the eaves, and at different locations depending on if it's a 1 or 2-story structure. And it works just like an interior fire system. However, when it's triggered, it floods the exterior of the home with water, similar to like a drip line, and creates a moist environment that is not beneficial to flames or the house catching on fire. So those are pretty cool. You can look into that yourself. Number 8, strategic landscaping. Yes, we talked about this with the defensible area around the home, but it doesn't have to be boring. And you don't have to just say, I'm taking a 5 to 10 foot barrier and putting gray crushed gravel everywhere. We do want our homes to look aesthetically pleasing, but that could easily be achieved. You can look at some plants that have that perform better in a fire environment, or some trees that perform better in a fire environment. That's one thing. Limbing up your trees, obviously, etc., like we talked about. But one thing that's really popular these days is boulder work. Boulder work, fountain work surrounding boulders, features that are not vegetation. On my house, actually, I have a huge window in my great room that looks out, and within the 5-foot barrier right outside of that window, I have 3 huge boulders that are probably 4 foot in diameter each, strategically placed with uplighting, and that's the landscape. There's no plants in there. So you can look at landscape items that aren't going to be planting but still lead to a nice aesthetic, giving you some texture and some other components in that defensible space. So think about your landscaping when you're thinking about designing for fire mitigation. 9, and this is in neighborhoods, there's going to be built-in access, and typically in new homes, they're going to require, in some municipalities, you to think about fire truck turnarounds, access, etc. But just access for firefighters. How does that look for you? Interior or exterior? If you have a little land on the exterior, is it going to be easy for a fire truck to pull in, pull out? If you're in a neighborhood, accessibility into your house, if a fire touches your house, do you have clear pathways, clear walkways? Very similar to a fire escape plan, but you want to think about people coming in to help save the home if need be, or just trucks parking, accessibility, people being able to easily get next to the home with a hose. That kind of thing is really critical to think about. So access for firefighters. And in some more rural areas where you might not be in a neighborhood that has a bunch of fire hydrants, you might want to think about excess water storage to aid in the fire suppression effort. Typically, that would look like maybe you have a 10,000 gallon tank that is specifically storing water to be used in the event of a fire that the fire company can come tap a hose into, you can tap a hose into. This is not uncommon to have a fire reserve tank with water if you're in a very rural area. So that's something to think about. Actually, some, again, counties, municipalities require you have something like that if you're rural. Some don't, but if they don't, it's something to think about. Is an investment, but it, again, is not a bad investment to protect your assets. And then 10, this should be simple, whether you're in rural, neighborhood, whatever it may be, just regular maintenance. Do you have pine trees and are pine needles falling, and do you need to rake those up on an annual basis? I know that can get kind of crazy when you have pine trees. Do you have vegetation? Maybe you don't have a defensible space, but do you have excess vegetation around the perimeter of your home that you need to trim back? Do you have weeds, grass, etc.? Not everyone's house is manicured, touching the home structure, and you need to mow that down and create that defensible space a little better. Or do you have trees overhanging the roof structure or touching the structure, or that just in general tree canopies that are too close together? Oftentimes fire, when it catches trees, if the trees are clustered too tight together, it can just rip through those things like kindling. But what a lot of places are doing are trying to limit the number of trees in a cluster and limit the spacing between clusters. So for instance, if you live in a heavily treed area, and if you have the budget to do it, maybe look at some strategic trimming so you don't have a cluster of 50 trees together, all within 5 to 10 feet. Maybe you could thin it out so you have a cluster of 3, and then on the canopy there's a little air gap, and you have another cluster of 3, and you could strategically plan to have some fire mitigation built in that sense. So just maintenance of the home, of the structure, is really critical to not allowing fire to continue in its path often. So those are my 10 points for building practices that help with fire mitigation. Now, these are there. You can go down the rabbit hole in this structure or in this vein. There's a lot of other building practices that I didn't touch on just because they're too niche. There's things like ICF concrete forms. That's insulated concrete, where basically your walls are built purely out of concrete. Many other countries in Europe, they build with CMU block and everything's out of concrete. So literally, like, the house cannot catch on fire because there's no wood. We're not quite there yet. I don't know that we ever will be to that point. Like, the architecture in other countries is different. It's also a lot smaller. So to build the size homes that we're used to in America out of ICF or out of CMU block would be quite costly, and you would be limited in a lot of the things you can do. There's also unique building products that you can explore, from, treated studs, shear, this, that, the other, that are all surrounding this fire mitigation. But what I listed were just some common sense and easy things you can implement and do to help the home be more fire-wise. Again, I'll go through the list of 10. Number 1, use fire-resistant materials. Number 2, creating a defensible space. Number 3, installing fire breaks. Number 4, looking at your windows and leaning towards fire-resistant windows. Number 5, having proper ventilation that is protected from ember intrusion or fire intrusion. 6, making sure all your gaps are sealed around the perimeter of your home and that you don't have any airflow that could allow embers, etc. Number 7, fire sprinkler systems. Enough said. 8, strategic landscaping. So you are mitigating vegetation against the house and maybe using some stone or other elements that are not combustible. 9, just making sure interior and exterior there's access for firefighters if needed to get to your structure. And 10, performing regular maintenance on the home to ensure that you don't have a kindle pile of dropped pine needles right out of your front door. Thank you, everybody. I hope this was helpful, and enjoy your weekend.